They didn't just think I was a failure. That night, my family made sure everyone at my brother's engagement dinner knew it. I sat quietly at the table, napkin on my knees, while my father laughed about my lost years. My brother smirked, and my mother nodded like it was fact. I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend myself. Then his fiancée leaned closer and whispered, "Wait, you're..." The room went still. Even my mother froze. Before I tell you what happened next, tap like, comment where you're listening from, and share if your family ever underestimated you, because that silence changed everything in that exact moment. My name is Lauren Hayes, and in my family, names only mattered if they came with titles people could brag about. Realtor, broker, investor, anything that sounded solid, predictable, and profitable. My name never did. It floated around the table like background noise, acknowledged only when someone needed a contrast. The engagement dinner was held in a private room downtown, the kind with dark wood walls and soft lighting meant to make everyone look successful. White tablecloths, heavy silverware, a server refilling glasses before anyone asked. My parents loved places like this. They believed the room you sat in said more about you than anything you could explain. I was seated 2 chairs away from my brother, close enough to hear every quiet joke, far enough to be left out of the center. He looked relaxed, confident, already practicing the role of future patriarch. People leaned toward him when they spoke, laughed a little harder. My parents watched him with the same expression they'd worn my entire life when they talked about him, relief mixed with pride. No one asked me how I was, not really. When someone did glance my way, my mother filled the space before I could answer. "Lauren's still figuring things out," she said gently, like she was smoothing a wrinkle only she could see. My father added something about patience, about how not everyone was built for real pressure. They smiled as if they were being generous. I focused on the table instead, the way the candle flickered, the faint smell of charred steak and pepper, the hum of conversations bleeding in from the dining room outside. These details grounded me. I'd learned a long time ago that if I stayed still, enough people would talk as if I wasn't there. My brother's fiancée sat across from me. She didn't dominate the table. She observed it. When my parents spoke, she listened without interrupting. When my brother talked about work, she asked questions that made him slow down. Her eyes moved carefully, taking in tone more than words. At one point, my father joked about how different my path had been. The table laughed politely. I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, the one that came from being turned into a story someone else controlled. I didn't correct him. I didn't defend myself. Silence had become my reflex, not because I was weak, but because I was tired of explaining a life no one wanted to understand. What no one at that table knew was that this wasn't just another dinner for me. It was a test of how long I could sit in a room built to exclude me, and what would happen if someone finally noticed the cracks. My name had always come last in conversations about success. Not announced, not celebrated, just appended like a footnote no one expected to read. That night at the restaurant wasn't new. It was simply louder. As my brother talked about his future plans, my parents leaned in, nodding at every sentence. My father added commentary, embellishing details, turning ordinary achievements into heroic stories. My mother smiled the way she always did when she believed she was presenting a perfect family to the world. Every so often, one of them glanced in my direction just long enough to remind me I was still part of the picture, barely. Their words carried me backward. A few months earlier, I'd opened my phone to see photos online from a gathering at my parents' house, a networking night, drinks on the patio, people in tailored jackets standing near the pool laughing. I hadn't been invited. When I asked my mother about it later, she sounded surprised that I'd noticed. She said it was very technical and she didn't want me to feel uncomfortable, as if being excluded was a kindness. Then there was the holiday barbecue, the heat, the smell of charcoal, paper plates bending under food. I'd been talking to someone near the fence when my father's voice rose above the music. He was bragging again about my brother, about the business, about legacy. Then he laughed and mentioned me, not with pride, with amusement. People smiled awkwardly. Someone patted my arm like I'd lost something important, and everyone knew it. Back at the dinner table, my brother lifted his glass and made a comment about how not everyone takes the traditional route. He said it casually, like an observation, but his eyes flicked toward me. a reminder, a line drawn. I felt the familiar pressure behind my ribs, the urge to speak, to correct the story, to say something sharp enough to make them stop. Instead, I took a slow breath and folded my hands tighter. I'd learned that reacting only gave them more control. Silence at least belonged to me. The worst part wasn't the jokes, it was the offers. My brother once called me before the engagement, dinner voice soft concerned. He asked if I needed help buying something appropriate to wear, said he didn't want me to feel embarrassed. The implication was clear. I was the problem that needed managing. At the table, my mother leaned toward my brother's fiancée and spoke about my future like it was an unresolved inconvenience. She talked about stability, about how someone might take care of me one day. Her hand rested on my shoulder, light but possessive. That was the moment something shifted. I didn't look up right away. I focused on the sound of my heartbeat, steady and controlled. All those nights working alone, all the calls I couldn't talk about, all the decisions I'd made without anyone's approval. They thought my quiet meant uncertainty. They thought my patience meant dependence. Across the table, my brother's fiancée was no longer smiling. She was watching, really watching. And for the first time that night, I had the unmistakable sense that the story they'd been telling about me was about to run out of room. I didn't flinch when my mother's hand stayed on my shoulder a second too long. I didn't look at my brother when he nodded like the matter of my future had been neatly resolved. Outwardly, I stayed exactly the same, calm, still agreeable. Inside, something finally settled into place. The truth was, my life had never been as uncertain as they believed. It just didn't look like theirs. While my parents hosted dinners and talked loudly about growth and reputation, my days ran on a different clock. Early mornings blurred into nights. My apartment stayed quiet except for the low hum of my laptop fan and the occasional buzz of a call coming in from a different time zone. I learned to measure progress in small confirmations, signed documents, cleared payments, short messages that said we're moving forward. There was no applause, no audience, just momentum. I never talked about it, not because I was ashamed, but because I couldn't. The work demanded silence. Agreements were still fragile. One loose word could undo months of preparation. So when my family offered help money advice, I smiled and declined. Letting them underestimate me was safer than correcting them. That night at the restaurant, as conversation flowed around me, I realized how deeply they'd mistaken restraint for weakness. They saw my rented apartment as proof I'd failed. They saw my simple clothes as surrender. They didn't see the discipline it took to live quietly while building something that couldn't afford distractions. My brother leaned back in his chair, satisfied. My father ordered another round. My mother talked about future holidays, already planning who would sit where. They were comfortable, certain. I felt the shift before anything was said. Across the table, my brother's fiancée had stopped engaging with the family's stories. Her gaze returned to me again and again, thoughtful, focused. She wasn't listening to the words anymore. She was watching the pauses, the moments when I chose not to speak, the way I didn't rush to defend myself. I'd seen that look before on calls where people realized they'd made the wrong assumptions. For the first time all evening, I let myself breathe a little deeper. Not because I expected rescue, not because I needed validation, but because I understood something they didn't control doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits. The dinner continued, but the balance had already changed. My parents were still talking, still performing. My brother was still confident, yet there was a growing tension beneath the surface, like a quiet wire pulled too tight. I stayed seated. I stayed silent. Not because I had nowhere else to be,